My own father stood at my brother's wedding, looked straight at me, and called me just a farmer in front of a room full of powerful executives. 3 days later, we walked into the same corporate boardroom, and everything he believed about me collapsed in front of his colleagues. Stay until the end, because this story took turns I never saw coming. And if you enjoy emotional family dramas with shocking twists and satisfying endings, don't forget to subscribe. My father looked directly at me during my brother's wedding reception, lifted his champagne glass with a proud smile, and said loud enough for every executive at the table to hear, "Charlotte, don't ask her about business. She's just a farmer." The laughter spread across the ballroom almost instantly. Some people chuckled politely because they worked with my father. Others laughed because they assumed he was telling the truth. I simply kept my hands folded in my lap. My name is Charlotte Ferrari. Everything you're about to hear happened exactly as I lived it. If someone had told me that the biggest humiliation of my life would begin inside a luxury wedding venue and end months later inside one of the most expensive corporate boardrooms in the state, I probably would have laughed too. Instead, I became the person everyone underestimated. And that turned out to be the biggest mistake anyone in that room could make. 3 days after that wedding, my father ordered me to appear at his company's headquarters. He wanted me to apologize. He believed I had embarrassed the Ferrari family. What he didn't know was that I already had an invitation to that same building for a reason he couldn't even imagine. But before I tell you what happened there, let me explain how everything reached that point. My name is Charlotte Ferrari. I'm 34 years old, and I own a regenerative agriculture company that supplies premium produce to luxury hotels, research hospitals, and private culinary institutions across 3 states. Most people don't know that. Most people never ask. They hear the word farmer, and their imagination immediately stops. They picture muddy boots, old tractors, and someone struggling to make a living from a small piece of land. I stopped correcting people years ago. The truth doesn't become more valuable simply because someone refuses to believe it. My company operates under the name Verdant Meridian Holdings. The business started with 42 acres of neglected farmland that nobody wanted. The soil had been overworked for decades. The irrigation system barely functioned. Even local banks considered the property a financial mistake. I bought it anyway. Everyone thought I was making an emotional decision. In reality, I had spent months studying satellite soil reports, groundwater maps, climate projections, and crop rotation data before signing the paperwork. The land wasn't broken. It had simply been misunderstood. That difference changed everything. Over the following years, my team rebuilt the soil, modernized irrigation, introduced precision agriculture, and partnered with researchers who specialized in sustainable food production. Little by little, our harvest quality improved. Then restaurants began calling. Luxury resorts followed. Hospitals requested contracts because our produce met nutritional standards they struggled to find elsewhere. Growth happened quietly, exactly the way I preferred it. My family never noticed. Or perhaps they never cared enough to look. Dad certainly didn't. To him, success always had a very specific appearance. It wore expensive suits. It occupied corner offices. It attended shareholder meetings. It traveled in business class. It carried executive titles that sounded impressive at dinner parties. Anything outside that image simply didn't count. Especially farming. Growing up, my father wasn't cruel every single day. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, he specialized in quiet disappointment. When I graduated from university with degrees related to agricultural science and business management, he congratulated me politely before asking why I hadn't chosen finance. When I purchased my first farmland, he asked how long it would take before I found a real career. When my company hired its 50th employee, he asked whether I had considered applying for corporate management somewhere. He never insulted my intelligence. He insulted my choices. There was a difference. Over time, I stopped defending myself. Arguments require 2 people willing to listen. Dad had already decided who I was. Nothing I accomplished could compete with the version of me that existed inside his head. My younger brother, Nolan Ferrari, inherited more than our father's last name. He inherited his worldview. Nolan worked in commercial finance. He loved luxury watches, imported sports cars, expensive networking events, and conversations about promotions. He wasn't a bad person. He simply believed achievement only existed if everyone could recognize it immediately. We rarely argued. We simply lived in different worlds. Months before his wedding, family dinners became increasingly uncomfortable. Every gathering followed the same pattern. Dad talked about corporate restructuring. Nolan discussed investment portfolios. Someone eventually remembered I was sitting at the table. "So, Charlotte," an aunt would ask with a sympathetic smile, "still working on the farm?" "Yes." "Keeping busy?" "Very." "That's nice." Then the conversation moved on before anyone asked another question. Nobody wanted details. They had already reduced my entire career to one word: pharma. Eventually I accepted the role they had written for me. Not because it was accurate, because correcting them became exhausting. 6 months before the wedding, Verdant Meridian secured the largest agreement in company history. The contract would supply premium produce to a network of hospitals and hospitality groups across multiple states. The value exceeded $80 million over several years. The negotiations had taken nearly 11 months. Legal teams worked through hundreds of pages of documentation. Food safety specialists inspected every growing facility. Financial analysts evaluated our production capacity. We passed every review. I celebrated that evening with my employees inside our main greenhouse. No champagne, no speeches, just pizza, folding chairs, and people who had worked unbelievably hard to earn that moment. None of my family attended. I never invited them. Experience had taught me that sharing good news often led to uncomfortable comparisons. So I simply kept building my company, quietly. Meanwhile, Nolan's wedding approached. My mother insisted I attend every family event connected to it. The rehearsal dinner, the engagement celebration, the final planning weekend. I attended because I loved my brother despite our differences. At every event, however, Dad introduced me exactly the same way. "This is Charlotte." A short pause. "She runs a farm. Never entrepreneur. Never founder. Never business owner. Just a farmer." I noticed people reacting differently depending on who they were. Executives smiled politely before changing subjects. Business owners assumed my company must be tiny. Some guests offered gardening advice. One man asked if I sold pumpkins during autumn festivals. I smiled through every conversation. Explaining my actual business would have sounded like bragging. Silence required far less energy. The wedding finally arrived on a warm Saturday afternoon. The ceremony took place at a historic estate surrounded by carefully maintained gardens. White flowers lined the stone walkway leading toward the ceremony space. Live musicians played softly while guests found their seats. Everything looked elegant without feeling excessive. Nolan looked genuinely happy. That mattered more than anything else. For a few hours, the day unfolded peacefully. The ceremony ended. Photographs followed. Guests gathered inside the ballroom for dinner. Round tables filled the room beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. Corporate executives from my father's company occupied several tables near the front. I recognized none of them personally. They recognized my father immediately. He moved confidently from group to group, shaking hands and introducing relatives. I remained near the back of the room speaking with one of Nolan's college friends about sustainable food systems. It was one of the few conversations all evening that actually interested me. Then my father waved me over. I knew that gesture. It meant I was about to become part of someone else's performance. I walked toward the head table. Several executives smiled politely. One woman asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Dad laughed. "Oh, Charlotte." He took another sip of champagne. "Don't ask her about business." The executives waited. Dad grinned wider. "She's just a farmer." The table erupted with laughter. I looked around the room. Nolan stared down at his plate. My mother forced an uncomfortable smile. Nobody corrected him. Nobody asked what kind of farming. Nobody wondered whether there might be more to the story. At that exact moment, I realized something important. The room hadn't laughed because they knew me. They laughed because they trusted the person telling the joke. And my father had spent decades convincing people his opinion was always worth believing. I didn't leave the reception immediately. Walking out would have created a scene. And despite everything my father had just said, I refused to let my brother's wedding become about me. Instead, I smiled whenever someone looked my way, congratulated the newlyweds, and quietly returned to my table. Inside, however, I had already made a decision. I would stop trying to earn respect from people who had no interest in giving it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of speeches, music, and polite conversations. Guests filled the dance floor while waiters carried trays of desserts between the tables. I stood near one of the large windows overlooking the gardens, enjoying the silence away from the crowd. That was when I noticed something unusual. 2 executives from my father's company were standing several feet away. They weren't looking at the dance floor. They were looking at me. One of them leaned toward the other and quietly asked, "Did he just say her last name was Ferrari?" The other nodded. "Charlotte Ferrari." There was a brief silence. Then the older executive frowned. "I've heard that name before." His colleague replied just as quietly, "I think she's connected to Verdant Meridian." My attention sharpened immediately. I had never met either of them. More importantly, Verdant Meridian had always negotiated through legal representatives and senior commercial officers. My personal profile had remained intentionally low. The older executive slowly shook his head. "No. Impossible." Before I could hear anything else, another guest approached them, ending the conversation. Neither man came over to introduce himself. Neither did I. There was no reason to. I left the wedding shortly afterward. The drive back to my farm took almost 90 minutes. As city lights disappeared behind me, the familiar darkness of open countryside returned. By the time I reached the front gate, most of my staff had already gone home. Only the automated irrigation system could be heard in the distance. That sound always brought me peace. Unlike people, machines didn't care about appearances. They simply did their jobs. The following morning began like every other. I met with my operations manager, reviewed crop forecasts, approved equipment maintenance schedules, and joined a video conference with our logistics division. Halfway through the meeting, my legal director interrupted. "Charlotte, we've received another notification from Northbridge Distribution." Northbridge Distribution. The same corporation where my father had spent more than 25 years building his career. I opened the report. Another shipment had experienced unexplained delays. Fresh produce that should have arrived at a regional hospital before sunrise had remained inside a warehouse long enough to reduce its usable shelf life. It wasn't the first time. It was the 7th. At first, we blamed transportation. Then weather. Then warehouse staffing. Eventually the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every delayed shipment had passed through the same corporate distribution network. Every delay cost someone money. Restaurants lost premium ingredients. Hospitals adjusted meal plans. Our company absorbed unnecessary expenses. Something wasn't right. I instructed our compliance department to document every incident. Not because I wanted a fight. Because good businesses survive by understanding problems before making accusations. Over the next several weeks, our internal reports grew thicker. Shipping records. Temperature logs. Driver statements. Delivery confirmations. Warehouse timestamps. Each document revealed another small inconsistency. Separately, they looked harmless. Together, they suggested intentional interference. I still didn't know who was responsible. Only that someone inside Northbridge Distribution appeared to be manipulating supply schedules. I deliberately kept my father's name out of every discussion. There was no evidence connecting him to anything. Besides, our relationship was already complicated enough. 3 days after the wedding, I was reviewing greenhouse expansion plans when my phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed one word. Dad. I considered letting it ring. Instead, I answered. "Hello." His voice carried none of the warmth people usually reserve for family. "Where are you?" "At work." "I need you downtown tomorrow morning." I leaned back in my chair. "For what?" "You embarrassed me at Nolan's wedding." For a moment, I honestly wondered whether I had heard him correctly. "I embarrassed you?" "You stood there acting offended in front of senior executives." I didn't say a single word. "Exactly." His answer surprised even me. "You made everyone uncomfortable." I closed my eyes briefly. "So what is it you want?" "I've arranged for you to come to headquarters." There was complete confidence in his voice. "You'll apologize for the misunderstanding." I almost laughed. What misunderstanding? People left that reception asking questions they shouldn't be asking. I remained silent. He continued. "Our executive committee is already dealing with sensitive negotiations. I don't need distractions." Sensitive negotiations. Interesting choice of words. "I expect you there at 9 o'clock sharp." Then he ended the call. No goodbye. No question about whether I was available. Just an order. I placed the phone on my desk and stared through the office window toward the fields outside. Rows of vegetables stretched toward the horizon beneath the afternoon sun. Employees moved between greenhouses while autonomous equipment followed programmed harvesting routes. This was my world. Simple on the surface. Exceptionally complex underneath. My assistant knocked gently before entering. "You look like something happened." I smiled faintly. "My father invited me to his office." She raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound like good news." "It probably isn't." Before either of us could continue, Another notification appeared on my computer screen. It came from our legal department. Subject: Board meeting confirmation. I opened the email. It wasn't from my father. It wasn't even from his division. It came directly from the office of Northbridge Distribution's Executive Governance Committee. The message was brief. Ms. Charlotte Ferrari, your attendance has been confirmed for Thursday's executive board session. Visitor clearance has been approved. Please report to the executive reception desk at 8:45 a.m. I read the message twice. Then a third time. This invitation had been arranged days before the wedding. Long before my father's phone call. He believed he was summoning me. The truth was much more interesting. Someone far above his position already expected me to be there. I closed the email without telling anyone. If my father wanted to believe he was in control, I saw no reason to correct him. Not yet. The next morning, I left the farm before sunrise. The city skyline slowly appeared as the highway curved toward downtown. Glass towers reflected the morning light. Traffic thickened with commuters heading toward offices that looked almost identical from the outside. Northbridge Distribution occupied one of the tallest buildings in the financial district. I parked in the underground garage and entered the lobby carrying nothing more than a leather portfolio containing several confidential reports. At exactly 8:43 a.m., I stepped toward the executive reception desk. The receptionist looked up. The moment she saw my face, she smiled warmly. "Good morning, Ms. Ferrari." She stood immediately. "We've been expecting you." Before I could answer, I heard familiar footsteps behind me. My father had just walked through the revolving doors. And the expression on his face changed the instant he realized the receptionist knew exactly who I was. I watched my father's expression shift from confidence to confusion in less than 2 seconds. He looked at the receptionist, then at me, then back at the receptionist. "You know my daughter?" he asked. The receptionist smiled politely. "Of course, Mr. Ferrari." She turned toward me. "Your visitor credentials have already been prepared, Ms. Ferrari." She handed me a premium access badge instead of the standard visitor pass. It had unrestricted executive floor clearance. My father noticed it immediately. His own badge allowed access to the same floor. For the first time in years, he looked genuinely uncertain. "There must be some mistake," he said. The receptionist checked her screen. "There isn't, sir." She looked back at me. "The governance committee requested that your badge be activated before 8 o'clock this morning." Dad frowned. "The governance committee?" "Yes, sir." She answered naturally, completely unaware that every word made him more uncomfortable. "I'll notify them that Miss Ferrari has arrived." She picked up the phone. Dad lowered his voice. "What exactly is going on?" "I was invited." "By who?" "I suppose we'll both find out." His jaw tightened. "I told you to come here because I wanted you to explain yourself." "I know." "Then don't create another problem." I almost smiled. I wasn't planning to. The elevator doors opened. Several executives entered the lobby. 2 of them immediately recognized me. "Good morning, Ms. Ferrari." I shook their hands. "Good morning." Dad remained completely silent. He clearly expected someone to explain why senior corporate officers seemed familiar with me. Nobody did. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt unusually long. No one spoke. The doors opened onto a hallway lined with glass offices overlooking the city. Employees moved quickly between conference rooms carrying tablets, financial reports, and legal binders. The atmosphere was noticeably tense. Whatever meeting was about to happen mattered. Dad led me toward the main boardroom. Outside the entrance stood several members of corporate security. One officer checked names against an attendance list. When my father gave his name, the officer nodded. Then he looked at me. "Welcome back, Ms. Ferrari." "Back." Dad caught that single word. "You've been here before?" I answered honestly. "Several times." He stared at me. "For what?" "Meetings." "What meetings?" "The confidential kind." Before he could ask another question, the boardroom doors opened. Inside sat nearly 20 people. Regional directors, legal counsel, financial auditors, risk management officers, independent board members. Most were reviewing thick folders. Several looked up as I entered. 3 people stood to greet me. One extended his hand. "Charlotte, thank you for coming. It's good to see you again." My father stopped walking. He wasn't introduced. He wasn't greeted first. For perhaps the first time in his entire corporate career, he wasn't the person receiving attention. He quietly took his assigned seat near the middle of the table. Mine was located much closer to the front. He noticed. Everyone noticed. Still, He seemed determined to believe there was a reasonable explanation. Perhaps I represented a supplier. Perhaps I was attending as an observer. Perhaps someone had made a scheduling error. The meeting began promptly at 9. The chair of corporate governance welcomed everyone before introducing the agenda. Today's session would address operational integrity, supplier risk, executive accountability, and strategic partnerships. Dad relaxed slightly. These topics fell within corporate management. Nothing unusual. Then the chair spoke again. Our first presentation concerns concerns raised by Verdant Meridian Holdings. Several board members opened identical reports. I recognized the cover immediately. It contained my company's logo. Dad leaned slightly toward the executive sitting beside him. What is Verdant Meridian? The executive whispered back. One of our largest strategic suppliers. Dad looked surprised. I've never met their owner. No. The executive continued reading. Very few people have. I kept my eyes forward. The chair nodded toward me. Ms. Ferrari, thank you for cooperating throughout the review process. My pleasure. Dad slowly turned his head. He looked directly at me. Then back toward the company logo. Then at the meeting agenda. His face lost all color. The connection had finally reached him. Charlotte Ferrari. Verdant Meridian Holdings. They were the same person. Before he could process that realization, another woman entered the room carrying several sealed evidence boxes. She wasn't part of management. She represented the corporation's independent ethics office. Everyone immediately became more serious. She placed the boxes carefully on the conference table. I appreciate everyone's attendance. Her voice remained calm. What we're about to discuss concerns evidence collected over the last 11 months. The room became completely silent. She opened the first box. Inside were hundreds of printed documents organized into labeled sections. Shipping records, internal approvals, warehouse logs, digital communication summaries, financial reconciliations. Nothing about this resembled an ordinary supplier presentation. The ethics commissioner looked toward me. Ms. Ferrari, your investigative team has been exceptionally thorough. Thank you. We independently verified every document your company submitted. My father stared at me without blinking. I could almost hear the questions racing through his mind. Investigative team? Verified evidence? Why would a farming company need investigators? The commissioner continued. Initially, we believed repeated shipment failures resulted from operational inefficiencies. She clicked a remote. A large display illuminated behind her. Charts appeared across the screen. Delivery timelines. Inventory movements. Regional warehouse activity. Delayed shipments highlighted in red. The pattern changed our conclusion. She advanced to the next slide. Every delayed shipment shared one thing in common. The same distribution division. The same approval chain. The same executive oversight. Murmurs spread around the room. Several directors exchanged concerned looks. Dad leaned closer to the screen. His division appeared repeatedly. He swallowed hard. The commissioner wasn't accusing him. Not yet. But the evidence clearly pointed somewhere inside his department. She took another folder from the evidence box. Our investigation no longer concerns delayed produce. She paused. It concerns deliberate manipulation of supplier operations. The room fell silent again. One board member quietly asked, "Do we know who is responsible?" The commissioner looked toward the far end of the table. Yes. Every head turned in the same direction. Including mine. The man sitting there adjusted his expensive cufflinks before calmly closing his notebook. Victor Hale. Senior Executive Vice President. My father's longtime mentor. The executive he admired more than anyone else in the company. Victor smiled confidently, completely unfazed by the attention. Then he slowly stood. "I'm glad we're finally discussing this," he said. He looked directly at me. Because every single accusation presented today is fabricated. The entire boardroom froze. Victor Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table. He didn't look nervous. If anything, he appeared amused. He buttoned his suit jacket, glanced around the boardroom, and smiled as though the entire investigation had been nothing more than an inconvenience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what you've just seen is an impressive presentation." He nodded toward me. "Very detailed." Then he shrugged. Unfortunately, detailed doesn't always mean truthful. A few executives shifted in their seats. Victor had spent decades building his reputation inside the company. He was polished, articulate, and exceptionally persuasive. People trusted him because he always sounded certain. He walked toward the large display screen. The delays are real. He tapped one of the charts. No one disputes that. He moved to the next slide. But connecting those delays to intentional misconduct requires proof. He turned toward the board. Not assumptions. Then he looked directly at me. Ms. Ferrari owns a successful agricultural business. I respect that. The word respect sounded rehearsed. But she's also one of the suppliers financially affected by those delays. He spread his hands. She has every reason to shift blame toward this company. Several board members remained expressionless. Victor continued. Let's not forget. He pointed toward the evidence boxes. Every document presented here originated from her organization. He paused just long enough for the implication to settle. If I wanted to damage a corporation during contract negotiations, I'd probably create convincing paperwork too. A low murmur spread through the room. Dad slowly nodded. Not because he believed Victor completely, because believing Victor felt easier than believing his own daughter. The ethics commissioner waited until the room became quiet again. Mr. Hale. Yes. You've suggested these documents were manufactured. I have. And you're prepared to stand behind that statement? Absolutely. She gave a small nod. Very well. Without showing the slightest emotion, she turned toward the rear doors. Please come in. The doors opened. A middle-aged man wearing an employee identification badge entered the boardroom. He looked uncomfortable. Not frightened. Just tired. The commissioner introduced him. This is Owen Mercer. He has supervised Warehouse 7 for the past 12 years. Victor's smile faded ever so slightly. Only someone watching carefully would have noticed. Owen sat down across from the board members. The commissioner spoke gently. Mr. Mercer, could you explain why you contacted our office? Owen took a slow breath. Because people were being blamed for mistakes they didn't make. He folded his hands together. Drivers lost bonuses. Warehouse workers received disciplinary notices. Regional managers were threatened with termination. He looked toward Victor. And none of it reflected what was actually happening. Victor crossed his arms. You've always had performance issues, Owen. Owen ignored the interruption. Every Friday evening we received instructions to overwrite shipment schedules. Several directors immediately looked up. The commissioner asked, who issued those instructions? Owen answered without hesitation. The Executive Logistics Office. Everyone understood what that meant. Victor remained perfectly still. The commissioner continued. Did you follow those instructions? At first. What changed? Owen looked down for a moment before answering. I realized perfectly healthy food was being held in storage for no operational reason. He lifted his head again. Hospitals were waiting. Restaurants were waiting. Families were paying higher prices. And we were pretending the delays happened by accident. The room became silent once more. Victor stepped forward. Do you have any proof of these claims? Owen reached into the briefcase beside his chair. I thought someone might ask. He removed a portable encrypted drive. I stopped deleting the records. Instead, he placed the drive on the conference table. I copied everything. Victor's expression hardened. The commissioner accepted the drive and handed it to the company's information security director. Within minutes, the files appeared on the large screen. Access logs. System backups. Internal approval histories. Every deleted record had been preserved. The IT director began explaining the timeline. Our servers automatically record administrative activity. He enlarged one section of the report. Even when operational files are overwritten. Another chart appeared. Blue entries represented legitimate schedule updates. Red entries represented manual alterations. Almost every red entry occurred late on Friday evenings. Exactly as Owen had described. The IT director highlighted another column. Each modification required executive authorization. Someone quietly asked, can we identify which executive? Yes. He clicked another window. A list of administrator credentials appeared. Every altered shipment originated from the same executive account. Victor Hale. No one spoke. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the projector cooling fan. Victor immediately pointed toward the screen. Anyone could have used my credentials. The IT director calmly shook his head. Not according to our security system. He displayed another report. Biometric authentication logs. Fingerprint verification. Encrypted security token usage. Office entry records. Every access matched Victor's physical presence inside the building. The commissioner folded her hands. Mr. Hale. Yes. Would you still like to argue that someone impersonated you every Friday for nearly a year? Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he laughed. It sounded forced. This proves someone used my account. The IT director interrupted. It proves you used your account. Victor's confidence finally cracked. His breathing became heavier. His eyes searched the room, looking for support. None came. Several executives who had admired him for years refused to meet his gaze. My father stared at the evidence without moving. I had never seen him look so lost. The man he often described as the smartest executive in the company had just been connected to months of deliberate manipulation. Still, Victor wasn't finished. He straightened his jacket once more. If we're assigning responsibility, he said carefully, then perhaps we should discuss everyone who signed these operational summaries. He slowly turned toward my father. And that includes Gideon Ferrari. Every head in the boardroom swung toward my father, including mine. For the first time that morning, my father looked afraid. For a few long seconds, nobody spoke. Every pair of eyes in the boardroom settled on my father. Even the air felt heavier. Dad looked from Victor to the ethics commissioner, then to the stack of reports in front of him, as if he hoped the pages would suddenly change. Victor broke the silence. Gideon approved every weekly operations summary that crossed his desk. He folded his hands confidently. If these reports were manipulated, then he either knew about it. He paused just long enough. Or he failed to notice. The accusation landed exactly where Victor intended. Not as dramatic as fraud, but just enough to pull someone else into the fire with him. The chair of the board turned toward my father. Mr. Ferrari. Dad slowly stood. I never instructed anyone to delay shipments. Victor smiled. That wasn't the question. Dad swallowed. I signed reports based on the information presented to me. The ethics commissioner opened another binder. That much appears to be true. She looked toward the board. Our investigation found no evidence that Mr. Ferrari participated in the manipulation. Victor's smile weakened. She continued. However, that single word changed the atmosphere again. We did discover repeated warnings submitted by suppliers over the last 11 months. Several pages appeared on the screen. Formal complaints. Delivery discrepancy reports. Requests for operational review. Recommendations for independent audits. Every document had been received. Every document had been acknowledged. Very few had been acted upon. The commissioner highlighted one series of emails. These warnings came from Verdant Meridian Holdings. I recognized them immediately. Our compliance department had submitted every concern through official channels. Professional. Documented. Respectful. No accusations. Only requests for investigation. The chair asked quietly. Who reviewed these? The commissioner answered. Mr. Ferrari's office. Dad closed his eyes for a brief moment. I remember seeing some of them. The commissioner nodded. Our interviews suggest you believe the supplier was exaggerating routine logistics problems. He didn't argue. Because she was right. I thought the delays were operational. You never requested an independent review. No. You never met personally with the supplier. No. You dismissed every escalation. Dad's shoulders lowered. Yes. The room remained silent. Nobody looked angry anymore. Only disappointed. The commissioner closed the folder. Mr. Ferrari did not commit fraud. She spoke clearly so there would be no misunderstanding. But he repeatedly ignored credible evidence because he trusted internal assumptions more than verified facts. Those words hurt him more than any accusation could have. His entire career had been built on the belief that his judgment was reliable. Now the board was hearing that his greatest mistake wasn't dishonesty. It was arrogance. The chair thanked the investigative team before asking the board to recess for a private vote. Everyone except the board members and legal counsel was asked to leave. Dad and I stepped into the executive lounge without saying a word. The room overlooked the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. Coffee machines hummed quietly in the corner. No one touched them. Victor stood several yards away speaking rapidly with his attorneys. For the first time all morning, his confidence had disappeared. He kept checking his phone. His lawyers kept shaking their heads. Dad finally spoke. I don't understand. I looked at him. What don't you understand? He rubbed his forehead. How did you build all of this without anyone knowing? I smiled faintly. I never hid it. He looked confused. You never asked. That answer seemed to hit him harder than anything said during the meeting. He sat down slowly. I thought. He stopped. You thought farming meant failure. He nodded without looking at me. I suppose I did. Neither of us spoke again. About 30 minutes later, security officers entered the lounge. They walked directly toward Victor. One of the attorneys whispered something to him. Victor immediately protested. "This is outrageous." The security supervisor remained calm. "The board has reached its decision." Victor demanded another meeting. Another review. Another opportunity to explain himself. None was granted. He was escorted back into the boardroom only long enough to receive formal notice. When the doors reopened, every executive was invited inside except Victor. His employment had been terminated effective immediately. The chair addressed the remaining attendees. "The board unanimously accepts the findings of the Independent Ethics Office." He turned toward me. "Ms. Ferrari, thank you for refusing to abandon this investigation despite the financial impact on your company." I nodded. "My team simply wanted the truth." He then looked toward my father. "Mr. Ferrari." Dad stood. "While the board finds no evidence of misconduct, your failure to investigate repeated supplier concerns represents a serious breakdown in executive responsibility." The chair placed a document on the table. "Effective immediately, your executive authority over supplier operations is revoked." Dad didn't argue. He signed the acknowledgement form with a steady hand. Years of authority disappeared with a single signature. Not because he had stolen. Not because he had lied. Because he had stopped listening. As the meeting ended, people quietly gathered their files and left the room. Several executives approached me to apologize for the unnecessary delays my company had experienced. Others thanked my investigation team for exposing a problem that had affected far more businesses than anyone realized. Dad remained seated, long after nearly everyone else had gone. Finally, he stood and walked toward me. There was no audience now. No executives. No family members. Just the two of us. "When?" he asked quietly, "did you become this successful?" I looked at him for several seconds before answering. "Around the same time you stopped asking how I was doing." His eyes filled with regret. Not dramatic regret. Not the kind people perform for sympathy. The quiet kind. The kind that arrives when someone realizes they missed years they can never get back. I picked up my portfolio. "I should go. Charlotte." I turned. He struggled to find the words. He stopped again. For the first time in my life, my father couldn't finish a sentence. I gave him a small nod. "You don't owe me an impressive speech." I walked toward the boardroom doors. Just before leaving, I looked back one final time. He was still standing in the same place. Not like an executive. Not like the confident man who had laughed at his own daughter during a wedding. Just a father finally realizing that he had spent years judging someone he had never truly taken the time to know. 3 months passed after the board meeting. Life, unlike dramatic headlines, rarely pauses after a major scandal. The field still needed irrigation. Harvest schedules still had to be approved. Employees still arrived before sunrise. Customers still expected the highest quality. I returned to my routine almost immediately. If anything, business became even busier. News about Northbridge Distribution's internal investigation spread quickly throughout the agricultural industry. Companies that had quietly watched the situation from a distance suddenly began reaching out. Several hotel groups expanded their contracts with us. 2 hospital networks signed long-term agreements. An international culinary supplier requested a partnership meeting. None of those opportunities appeared because people felt sorry for me. They appeared because trust had become more valuable than marketing. Our company had protected the truth even when it would have been easier to walk away. That reputation mattered. Victor Hale's future looked very different. The corporation officially announced his termination less than a week after the investigation concluded. Regulatory agencies opened their own inquiries. Former suppliers came forward with similar experiences. Several warehouse managers agreed to testify. Financial investigators uncovered evidence that manipulated shipment delays had pressured smaller producers into accepting unfair contract terms. The scheme had lasted much longer than anyone originally believed. Industry organizations removed Victor from advisory committees. Professional memberships disappeared. Speaking invitations were canceled. The executive who had once built his career on influence suddenly found himself with almost none. Ironically, the reputation he valued more than anything else became the very thing he lost forever. As for my father, the changes were quieter. His office moved from executive floor to a smaller management suite. His responsibilities became operational rather than strategic. He no longer attended high-level board sessions. Some people assumed the demotion would make him bitter. Instead, something unexpected happened. He became noticeably quieter. According to several employees who had known him for years, he started asking more questions during meetings. He requested data instead of assumptions. He listened before making decisions. Perhaps losing authority had finally taught him the value of paying attention. I didn't speak with him during those 3 months. Not because I wanted revenge. Because healing cannot be scheduled like a business meeting. Some conversations require time before they become honest. One cool autumn morning, I noticed a familiar sedan driving slowly toward the main entrance of our farm. It wasn't a company vehicle. It wasn't accompanied by security. Only one person stepped out. My father. He wasn't wearing one of his expensive tailored suits. Instead, he wore simple jeans, work boots that still looked brand new, and a plain jacket. He looked strangely uncomfortable, almost like someone visiting a country where he didn't speak the language. I walked over to meet him. I wasn't sure you'd let me come. You drove all the way here. I figured I should at least try. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I pointed toward the fields. Come on. We spent the next several hours walking across the property. I didn't give him the polished presentation prepared for investors. I showed him the real business. He watched technicians analyze soil samples inside the laboratory. He met plant scientists studying disease-resistant crop varieties. He observed autonomous harvest equipment moving carefully between vegetable rows. He spoke with logistics coordinators tracking deliveries across multiple states in real time. He toured our packaging facility, where every shipment was inspected before leaving the farm. He asked questions. Actual questions. Not sarcastic ones. Not dismissive ones. Curious ones. How many people work here now? Just over 300. How many acres are you managing? A little over 4,000 between owned and leased properties. Those hospital contracts. They renew next spring. He nodded thoughtfully. The deeper we walked into the operation, the quieter he became. Eventually, we stopped beside one of the oldest sections of farmland. It was the original 42 acres that had started everything. The irrigation lines looked much newer now. The soil was healthier. Rows of vegetables stretched farther than they had years earlier. Dad looked across the fields for a long time. Finally, he spoke. I spent years believing success had to look a certain way. I waited. I thought if someone wasn't sitting behind a conference table. He shook his head. They couldn't possibly be leading something important. I looked at him. You weren't the only one who believed that. No. He smiled sadly. But I was your father. Those words carried more weight than any apology could have. He took a slow breath. I owe you one. I didn't interrupt. I confused appearance with importance. The wind moved gently across the fields between us. I judged your work because I never bothered to understand it. He looked directly at me. And every time I introduced you as just a farmer, his voice became quieter. I was really telling everyone how little I understood about my own daughter. For the first time since I was a little girl, I saw embarrassment in his eyes instead of pride. Not embarrassment because other people had corrected him. Embarrassment because he had finally corrected himself. I can't undo that, he continued. I know. But I can stop repeating it. I nodded. That's enough for today. He smiled. A genuine one. Small. Honest. Unforced. Before leaving, he asked one last question. Would it be all right if I came back sometime? I looked around the farm that had changed my life. The place everyone else had underestimated. Including him. Next time, I said, wear boots you don't mind getting dirty. He laughed. So that's a yes? That's a yes. He drove away just before sunset. I stood there until his car disappeared beyond the entrance road. People often ask whether success is the best form of revenge. I don't think it is. Revenge keeps you focused on the people who doubted you. Success allows you to focus on the life you're building instead. My father once believed I was just a farmer. Today, he introduces me differently. This is my daughter, Charlotte. She built one of the most respected agricultural companies in the region. He never exaggerates. He never adds titles. He simply tells the truth. And somehow, the truth has always been more than enough. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this. Never measure someone's worth by how their job looks from the outside. The quietest people in the room are often building the strongest futures, and respect should always be earned through character, not appearances. Thank you for staying with me until the end of Charlotte Ferrari's journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more original stories filled with family drama, unexpected twists, and satisfying endings. I'll see you in the next story.